I typically will go in this direction because it is kind of chronological that way. And you go from this side being artists who are inspired by seeing the animals in, representations of them in zoos, of course, or in art museums like the Louvre, and seeing how other animals have painted them. So these are all up until you get to Rosa Bonheur, who Rachel's going to talk about. They're not observing animals in the wild. They're in zoos, they're in their imagination, they're in museums, looking at other artists' depictions, things like that. Or, sometimes we have some really old pieces right in here, going from verbal descriptions even, having never seen the live animal themselves. And then when you get over to this part of the room, you get into the artists, European artists, who all of a sudden are going beyond that. It's not good enough anymore. They're trained in the European art academies, but just relying on zoos and other artists' representations in museums, they need to go out into the field and see. And it became a little bit easier to travel, not super easy still. It was still really challenging to travel to other continents. But I'm going to start in this corner I'm going to start with Bruno Liljefors. And I'm sure you've all seen the sign here that says the Big Four. And you've probably, some of you talked about the Big Four. And what the Big Four references is four artists, Bruno Liljefors, Wilhelm Kuhnert, Richard Friese, and of course our own Carl Rungius are the Big Four. And they all were from, about the same time period. They were working in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And for each of those four artists, it was very important that they go out into the natural habitat and paint animals that they observed with their own eyes in the natural habitat. That's what they all have in common. And those four artists really changed the way that wildlife art started to be seen and started to be done in the future. So they marked that change. In the future, after the Big Four, any wildlife artist that is serious goes out into the field and depicts the animal in its natural habitat. What am I forgetting about introducing the Big Four? That's why they're important.
So paint get in a tube just about then too.
Yes,
so
yes,
right
that's
after
what
the
I'm
Civil War,
forgetting.
paint got in a tube so they could actually go
outside and paint. And most of them did go out I think all of them did go out in the field with their painting with their oil paints in the tubes, create sketches like you all know Carl Rungius did lots of small paintings on location. They did drawings on location, and in each case, for each of these four artists, then they would go back to their studio, wherever that was, and reference the images done in the field. So this was, we know Carl Rungius, took some photographs. You can see one of his cameras in the case there. But photography wasn't what it is today. They may have relied on it if they had that option. And in fact, I don't even know about Liljefors and Kuhnert. I haven't read any reference to them taking photographs, but just going out into the field. So I'll start with Bruno Liljefors, who's a Swedish artist, and he lived from 1860 to 1939. In a little bit when I switched to Wilhelm Kuhnert. So Swedish artist, German artist. Very similar, their birth and death dates, fairly similar. They were born within 5 years of each other. Similar in the fact that they were both trained in art schools. I don't believe that Liljefors ever quite finished. He withdrew before he had finished his course of study, never got his degree. Liljefors, another difference though, Liljefors was a hunter. Kuhnert never hunted himself, at least not professionally. He was really well known as a hunter. As you know, Rungius was well known as a hunter. Who am I forgetting? Friese was well known as a hunter. So of the four, Liljefors was the only one who was not a hunter himself. Kuhnert was the only one who was not a hunter himself. Liljefors was a hunter. And in fact, because Liljefors was a hunter, he was really interested in that predator-prey relationship. When you think of the paintings that we have of his, in this collection. This is one of the best known ones we have of his in our collection, and the peregrine falcon is hunting the mallard duck. And then there's the one that we often have in JKM, and I lose track of which ones are up and which ones are, I don't think it's up right now, but it's a pine marten hunting the capercaillie, which is like a grouse-like, turkey-like bird in the tree. I'm trying to think what else. He really loved that predator-prey relationship, and he depicted that in his paintings quite a bit. He was definitely influenced by the Impressionist painters, so this was the time when the Impressionists in France were making such a splash with, trying to capture the momentary effects of light in the landscape. And you can see that, especially down in the lower part of this painting, but also with the blur, there's a lot of things that are kind of, it has the impression of quick painting to capture a glimpse, like how did it look at that moment in time? And the wind blowing the foliage down here, the flash of the blue on the wing of the mallard is just a quick impression in time. You see it, and he's trying to capture how the eye sees rather than how a camera would freeze the action. So a lot of people look at this and they're like, what? And that's why we put this painting right nearby, so you can see the blue patch of feathers. I've had people on the tour say, what is that? They don't read it. It doesn't read as a part of the bird's wing to some people. So that's why we put the other mallard there so you can see it.
In the painting.
For some people, it certainly does. I've had enough people ask me about it, but I think I now see it as just a momentary flash. You know how it is when a bird goes by and if it's bright, the impression left is just a blue flash, if it's a bluebird flying by. And he's trying to capture that impression of that quick impression, how the eye might see that scene. He was also, this was something I did not know until I read this recently, he was also very influenced by Japanese art.
Oh.
Do you see that in this painting? Do you see that in this painting?
I do see some minimalism in terms of some things left as voids and not given much attention. So negative, almost negative space with this is something not the main area of attention. I don't know. I'd have to read more about it to see how that might have influenced his work.
Well, I see that in the blowing grasses.
Do you see
Those grasses are very blue-like.
Right, like the ink, when you see the ink paintings with the bamboo kind of fading off.
The line work.
Yeah, I can see it now that you mention that. When you look at his work, like this one's pretty bright, right? But think about some others in our collection, like if you're familiar with the pine marten one, it's very dark. And art historians have surmised that his art did become darker and more foreboding and more kind of almost like a somber feeling to it during the latter part of the 19th century. And most art historians think that brooding element that entered into his art at that time comes from the turmoil in his private life. So he married a young woman named Anna when he was a young man, and they had many kids together, and then he later divorced her and married her younger sister. And at this time, they had many children, and he was never making it financially. He was always in trouble financially. And that art historians say this is why his art gets darker at that period of his life. I don't know much more about that.
Divorce is expensive.
Yes. And I'm sure expensive and difficult, much more difficult back then than it is now, and had more, I wouldn't say more, but certainly in his case had a lot of financial implications. Another interesting thing about him, at this time in his life too, when he was undergoing so much personal turmoil, and maybe this was true his whole life, but I especially read about it in this latter part of his life. He was such an outdoorsman, and he had so many stresses, and he loved being outdoors that he would go out early in the morning, pack a lunch, and be gone the whole day, and come back to the home when the sun was setting.
For dinner.
Yes. But he did love spending time outdoors. He was not from a wealthy family at all. He was from a very poor family. And as I was reading more about him, neighbors in the community he grew up in, everybody noticed his talent as an artist at a very young age. And friends and neighbors would purchase art supplies for him to encourage him to do his art, which is a really nice story. That the community supported him as an artist.
Jane, out of curiosity, do you know what part of Sweden?
Yes, let's see if I wrote that down.
It's not important, just, I thought maybe.
I don't. He moved around a little bit, but it was always in Sweden. He didn't
Yeah.
travel the way that Kuhnert traveled to many different continents. He believed in painting animals in the wild, but primarily, as far as I know, it was around Sweden, different areas around Sweden. So when you look at his paintings, those are the animals that you see in his paintings. Another interesting fact is he had his own collection, menagerie of animals
Oh,
that he kept nearby. So he was clearly an animal lover. Like, I think of someone like Lainey, who we have visited in Crowheart, and she has her animals surrounding her that are really are her family. He was the same way. He had a collection of animals which included foxes, badgers, hares, squirrels, weasels, and an eagle. Very interesting.
Row your own.
Yeah. Let's see here, what else? Where he got his training was the Royal Swedish Academy of Arts. He is really well known in Sweden. He was an artist who I had not heard of, even though I studied art history in college until I came here. Same with Rungus, for that matter. So, many of our artists I had not heard of. But in Sweden, someone told me on a tour once, a Swedish man, that he's considered a national treasure in Sweden. I don't really know what that means. What does it mean to be a national treasure? Anyway, he's very well known and well loved.
Highly regarded.
Highly regarded. And if you ever have a Swedish person on a tour, they'll be really impressed that we have some of his paintings here in our collection.
how many do we have?
Okay, how many do we have?
They're not in this room.
I can think of
Yeah.
3. We have only one upright. We don't have a lot of them, certainly not compared to like Kuhnert or Rungus. We have, okay, I can think of this one, the one I mentioned with the capercaillie and the pine marten. I can think of a smaller watercolor of a hare.
There was one that the
What
paper
else?
was advertising of a gull
A gull.
that we didn't have up, but
Hasn't
they
been
ran
out,
the
but
ad
it's in the
with it.
collection.
Yeah.
You can always search the collection on our website too, if you haven't played with that feature, it's pretty fun. Under, what is it, under art, and then collection, and then you click a button that says search the collection.
Search the
You can
collection.
type in his last name, or I think maybe part of the last name, and it might come up if
And
you
it
can't
comes
spell
up.
it.
It's not,
And then it will-
it's not
There's
totally
things not the same,
complete.
but it'll let you
So it
see
might bring up
Yeah.
3 and maybe we have 5.
Right,
I mean, I don't think we have more than 5. At the most, I think I would say we have 5, and maybe it's not quite that many. And rarely would there be more than one out at a time of his work.
But the Soul Mallard, that's his as well, right?
Oh, yes, good point. There are 2 right here.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
small mallard is his as well, good point. Yeah. But I don't think we have anything else up of his right now in the museum. I think this is it.
All I know of is 3.
Or you can think of 3?
These, yeah.
Oh,
these
yeah.
2 and the
Right.
pine marten.
Yeah, his work is harder to come by than
Okay.
some artists. And I don't know if that was because he was less prolific or if some were lost in some war.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. That would be an interesting thing for somebody to research. So that's Bruno Liljefors. I'd like now to talk about Wilhelm Kuhnert. And some of you may remember that I think it was for a training within this past year that we talked a little bit about the lion painting that was hanging here
Yeah.
formerly.
Yeah.
It was right here. The reason that lion painting is not here is because some of you may know that our museum loaned 7 pieces of Kuhnert's work recently to an exhibit in Germany at the Schirn Museum in Frankfurt. And Emily, our registrar, just got back, like this week, from going over there. So when there's a big exhibit like that, the registrar has to travel with the art, especially when it's really valuable. Enough pieces, like 7 pieces of that value. So she actually got on a truck. No, she flew to Denver, maybe. Anyway, she rode the truck to LA and then flew on the plane to Frankfurt. And same thing in reverse. Cargo plane. And same thing in reverse when the exhibit ended just recently. But they had a huge exhibit at the Schern Museum in Frankfurt of a retrospective and a view, a beautiful, I mean, you can go online and look at it. The title of the exhibit, and there's a lot of information online right now, is King of the Animals, Wilhelm Kuhnert, and the Image of Africa is the whole title. King of the Animals is the short title. But it looked like a beautiful exhibit. And when it first opened over there earlier this winter or in the fall, I think it was in the fall, Adam and Steve flew over and were special guests when that exhibition opened up. So that's why the lion is not here. It was in that exhibit. All the work is back now. Emily has it in crates still. She hasn't, I don't think she's unpacked it all yet, but it's all back. So we have at least 7, since 7, we have more than 7 because this one would be another, and this one, and this one. These 3 are all Kuhnert. So we have more Kuhnerts than we have Liljefors. So a little bit about Kuhnert. I already mentioned that he lived approximately the same time that Liljefors did. He lived from 1865 to 1926. He was also educated at an Academy of the Arts. He was educated at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Berlin. His home was in Berlin, but unlike Liljefors, Kuhnert traveled a lot. Not just around Europe, but he traveled to different continents, which was a big break from the artists that came before him. He traveled to Scandinavia, Egypt, East Africa, and India. And his favorite animal to paint was the lion. And I think I talked about that last time we did a training in here. His friends called him Lion Kuhnert. And he did I can't remember. Does anybody remember how many lions he painted in his lifetime?
500, wasn't it?
Something
A lot,
like, yeah,
a
I think
lot.
Allison.
Yeah, I had that figure last time and I've forgotten it already. So, you know, unlike the artists who came before him who painted in zoos, he painted in the wild. He was, I already mentioned, not a professional hunter. So because of that, he had to put a lot of effort into finding the animals to paint them because he didn't know anything about tracking. He would hire guides and he would put a lot of time and effort into finding these animals.
Well, so now would he be able to be that close to a tiger? I mean, maybe you would have to see it more from a distance.
I would think
I
so.
hope so.
I would hope so too. And then you think about travel in that day and age, you wouldn't fly to Africa. You would take a ship and it would take a long time to get there. And when you arrived, you wouldn't have easy access via roads to all these wilderness areas. You would have to probably have a guide to show you where to go. But you know, the whole thing would have been really a huge undertaking and a huge commitment.
Yeah, didn't he have something like 80, he had to be they had to be in charge of feeding these people,
The whole entourage, right? So it wasn't just traveling by himself, it was this whole group, big group, and that's interesting because I didn't know how many the big group was, or up to 80 people maybe traveling
That's what
together.
I remember.
That's interesting.
Tom Mangelson said when you go out to do tigers now, you do it on an elephant.
I remember that, and there's a photo of him on an elephant.
Wow.
So maybe they
Yeah,
did it back then.
maybe they did it back
Maybe
then.
they did.
Because it was a
Yeah.
safety thing, and that's why when Tom Mangelson went there, why they were on the elephant back, because you're away, you're up high, you're away, and you can still see. And of course, they wouldn't be, at that time, on Jeeps or anything.
I could see sketching from the back of an elephant.
They said they could put that little tripod on in the back.
Right?
Yeah.
I would imagine, if I had to guess, I would say that was how he did it, but I have not read that.
But the gesture of the
Makes
animal,
sense.
how difficult it
I
would
know,
be.
yeah.
So that sounds like
So, obviously Africa was still largely unexplored and was very, it was like I said, a huge, huge undertaking to get there and to find these animals. What else about him? I bet Emily or Adam or Steve would have interesting things to say since they were just at this big exhibit. But if you go online and look up the Schirn Museum, you're gonna see all the images and lots of interpretive material. It's really interesting. S-H-I-R-N.
Did they print a book in English to go with that?
I don't know, that's a good question. That would be nice. I will have to ask Adam, because if they,
I should get with
if it was, it looks like a huge exhibit, and which makes me think there should be a catalog, which makes me think we should have a copy, and we can find out, yeah.
Amazing.
Anything else from those who give tours? What do you say? How do you lead into it? Any helpful hints that way?
The light is so interesting.
It's a
Adam says
stunning
that was his
piece.
favorite part of that, because
Yeah.
that hung in the What People Collect exhibit, and that was Bill and Jaffa's.
Oh,
And that hung in that,
that's
and
right.
Adam said he really, really liked it, he really, really wanted it, he really, really liked the light, because it's so different
It's amazing.
than Kuhnert's
Jackson
other.
Collects, I forgot that was a part
It
of the
was in
Jackson
that.
Collects exhibit last winter, right?
Yep.
Right.
Is that a paint buffalo?
Yes, uh-huh, yep.
The real buffalo.
What does he call it here? He says, an African Cape Buffalo at Sunset is the
Oh.
title of this one, and Buffalo Study, Cape Buffalo Study is the title of that one.
I don't know the distribution of Cape buffaloes, but I'm thinking that Namibia, which is down there on the Cape of South Africa, was a German colony originally. So, as Germany.
Yes, I was just reading this on the label here, it's worth reading. So Kuhnert was one of the first European painters to study African animals in the field. He took his first safari in 1891 to German East Africa.
Okay.
So
That
it
was
was a
it.
colony
Yeah.
of Germany.
Uh-huh.
In 1893, Kuhnert displayed his paintings at the Berliner Art Exhibition, where they won a Medal of Honor. In 1905, he took another trip to Africa, then sailed east to India. So again, the reference to you go by boat is how you travel, where he was able to study tigers. Kuhnert took his last safari to Africa in 1911. The sketches he made on these expeditions provided him with enough material to create paintings until his death in 1926. So yes, important to remember that they're collecting material, sketches, quick paintings on these trips, and then they all have all this reference material, and they go back to their studio, which was true of Rungius also. Small paintings and sketches.
But I was thinking about the language challenge when he first went, so
uh-huh.
he went to German East Africa, which solved that problem.
I was curious about his personal life. He's one that I never heard anything about his personal life.
Well, I know he married as a young man, and he divorced at some point along the way. I do not know any more than that.
Okay.
Yeah,
I know he
Describes it all.
it describes a lot. I know that's true. But well, it's interesting. These two men had a lot in common, really, aside from being born at approximately the same time and dying approximately the same time, studying approximately the same way, but in different academies. The biggest, they both married young and divorced and remarried. I don't know if he remarried, actually. I'm guessing he did, but I'd have to look that up.
Did he come from Wales? Kuhnert?
Yeah, more so, I don't know exactly, but more so than his counterpart, Liljefors.
What was your question?
Did he come from a wealthy family?
Oh,
Does anybody here know that?
No clue.
I think he had more well, the fact that he was able to travel more indicates more resources than Liljefors, who was in Europe and mostly.
And given art supplies.
Art supplies, right, the art supply issue. Which reminds me, I love that story of the community supported him as a young boy who was interested in art. It reminds me of Charlie Russell, who, was painting on scraps of cardboard, fence boards, and whatever he could get his hands on. He was short on art materials as a young artist, similar struggle. And it makes me think, Lisa, about the youth art exhibits we do here and all the things we do to support kids in our community who are interested in art, whether it's a scholarship to Photo at the Summit or a scholarship when they're graduating from high school to go on to study art in college, or
Giving the teachers money for art
giving the
supplies.
teachers money for art supplies, because they don't have a lot of money for art supplies. Even in the public schools, they don't have enough.
Makes a difference.
So we do everything we can to do the same thing, make it a little easier for them. Oh, and Studio Project is free for middle school and high school kids.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, let's switch to Rachel.
All right, we'll talk a little bit
Rachel,
about.
you want me to man the camera?
Oh, I'll just turn it and point it this way, and we'll talk about Rosa Bonheur, who was French, obviously. Bonheur. And she lived from 1822 to 1899. This is hers here. It's called King of the Forest. But, so she lived in an era when few women could really pursue a career in art. And she was one of the first women animal artists to actually gain recognition. And so contrary to the Victorian ideals of appropriate behavior for women, Bonheur was actually given government papers to dress as a man in the 1870s. So she could work in pants, which was
She had to
pretty
have
amazing.
government
She had
permission.
some kind of a government permission to be in public dressed as a man. She cut her hair short. She smoked cigars in public. Quite the scandalous character. She refused to ride a horse side saddle, the story goes. But through her rebellion, she was able to enhance her career, gain notoriety, and forge new ground for other women artists. So it's pretty cool that we have her in our collection. Not another name that's not particularly well known to most people who study art history or who might come to the museum and not know anything about her. Wouldn't be that uncommon. She went to unconventional lengths in order to produce realistic representations of animals. Like you mentioned with Liljefors, Bonheur apparently kept a menagerie as well. She had a kind of a family farm, maybe youngish in life, maybe as a teenager. I wasn't exactly sure of the years that they did this, but I read that they had, what did they have? A list of animals here. Ducks, rabbits, quails, squirrels, sheep, yaks, gazelle, and even a lion. She also frequented slaughterhouses to perform animal dissections and study anatomy, which again was an arena that normally a woman couldn't go to, but she basically disguised herself as a man and had her government papers and went to study animals. She also studied live animals at Paris's Jardin des Plantes, as Barry and others had done before her. So Rosa's father, Raymond Bonheur, was a moderately successful painter as well. So by age 13, Rosa started to study under him. I read that she had gotten kicked out of a couple of schools as a young child, that she was mostly doing art and not focusing on other things. And so eventually they said, all right, you've been kicked out twice, you can study under me. So her father taught her to sketch and draw. And from early on, Rosa preferred animals. Her first public success was 1841 when she exhibited and sold a painting and drawing at the Paris Salon. She was awarded a gold medal at the 1848 show. In 1853, she made a painting called The Horse Fair, which is now owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And that's one of the paintings that really kind of kicked off her career, I think, gave her international acclaim. Eventually, she succeeded her father as director of the School of Drawing for Young Girls, a position in which she was able to encourage young women to pursue artistic careers. By 1889, the Buffalo Bills Wild West show came to Paris, and that kind of piqued her interest in American wildlife. She never went to America, but she was kind of enthralled with the whole Wild West. And Annie Oakley, who of course shared her interest in women's suffrage and things like that. Bonheur said that she believed that American women were freer from social restraints. Which is kind of interesting. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but she believed it. The National Museum of Wildlife Art currently holds several other works, I think maybe 5, 6 others by Rosa, and we also have a really interesting autobiography in the library if anybody wanted to read. Have you read it?
I have.
Yeah.
You can get it through the problem with our library is you have to be in
You
there.
have to
to
sit
read
there
the
and
book.
read it, right?
But you can get it through the ILL system and pay $2 and you can get it through Teton County.
Mhm.
Also, Hoopla Digital has a 42-page downloadable, and you can get 10 books a month. That's got a nice, probably 10 pages of good info about her.
That
Because-
Hoopla?
Yeah, Hoopla Digital, because she has a crazy story
She really does.
from young,
Yeah.
you know.
Rachel, do you know whether or not she went in the field out there?
Yeah, so I mean, mostly what I read was that she loved horses in particular, so she spent a lot of time around horses. She had this menagerie. She went to, you know, the zoo, the big Paris zoo. That's about all I really read. I don't know that she traveled much outside of France. It sounds like she really didn't. So, and she lived in sort of a rural area, so.
Did she come to
She
the
came
city?
to the States.
Okay. I read that she hadn't, but that was only one.
Well, it's
Thing that I
hard
read.
to tell. I did read once that she did come to
Yeah.
the States.
But I'm
It
sure
wouldn't
during the Victorian era, it was hard for her just to travel, to be
Right.
freely traveling around her own community, let alone traveling around the world.
This was in the 19th.
Because I think that would be
Correct.
a question that people
No.
would ask,
Oh,
how
it
do
is
they
easy
get
now.
the image,
Right.
you know?
Do I remember that this is painted on silk?
Pastel on linen.
Yeah, it
Then,
says
Pastel
pastel
on
on
linen, that's why it's
so.
under glass.
also, wasn't the glass supposed to be a very
Yeah,
special
issues.
glass?
I'm sure it's like a non-glare.
It
Glare,
was.
Right. The
Do you remember?
local air.
Local
Or
or
something like that.
something we hadn't used before. And wasn't that frame, is that original?
I think I did read that this was the original, 19th century frame,
We
which
would
is
never,
an important
Yeah, we've
part of
never
it.
replace that at this point. It would be
So
too
where would this
expensive.
have been shown
It must have come with
with that big frame on it?
She had a lot of shows.
Yeah.
She won a lot of awards. When she started to paint, her first stuff sold at like 35. Her father wanted her to change her name to a man.
Well, she was born Rosa Lee, so
Right.
she shortened it to Rosa.
Right, because then they wanted a boy.
Mm.
And so they kept with, or they wanted to call her Raymond. At least that's what it said in her bio. She was the oldest of 4. And then they all got parceled off when her mom died. And they told her she had to learn sewing at 12. And she said, I don't want to sew, I want to paint. So she joined her father at art school, and that she cut her hair and dressed like a boy because they said a girl's not allowed to be here.
Right.
And
That's
that
when
way
she
could
started.
sit in on his classes.
Right, so that's kind of how she ended up. They always wanted her to be a boy. And then when she finally made it, changed her name, which was his name, Raymond.
Oh, she changed her name?
No, she didn't. He wanted her to,
Oh,
you know. And she didn't, I mean, the person who wrote her bio was her roommate. That was the
Right.
only person she let paint her,
Hmm.
was an American.
Wow.
Yeah, Anna Klink, I think that's who
Oh,
wrote
yes.
the book, Klinghoffer.
Clumpkin or-
Yeah,
Clumpy.
Anna Klink, or
Something.
something like that.
Clunky.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
it.
Yeah, that's all I have on Rosa Bonheur.
I was
Super
thinking
interesting.
hers, Audrey Hepburn, or
That's-
something like that.
Bobby does a great job, and that's kind of how I got hooked onto hers, because coming on one of Bobby's tours,
Uh-huh.
Bobby does a lovely job on this, and she calls her the Audrey Hepburn of.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
And the more you get into her, it's a crazy story. Just think about it, having a license to wear a pair of pants. But that's what Joan of Arc actually got burned at the stake for, so that kind of makes sense.
Another thing that I remember reading was she was very popular during her lifetime.
Yeah.
And they even had made a Rosa Bonheur doll that girls could have, have a doll in her likeness. And if you go online and do a little research, you can see what it looked like.
You can also see
I
it.
wonder if it smoked.
You can see a picture of it in the library too. In the library where we have we have a file on every artist. In Rosa's file, there's also a really nice portrait of her, like a print, like, it's really
Oh,
in good
that's
shape
a
and it's
good thing,
beautiful.
I'm glad you mentioned that,
Mhm.
because some of you may not know that you can go
You
in
have
there and look
access
in
to
the
those.
artist files, and, again, you can't take anything out, but you can sit there, you can pull the file and sit at the table and read it, and they're all alphabetical. If you go in, well, they're along the wall that is parallel to the hallway outside. That's where the artist files are, and they're big drawers, and it says like A through G, or, and then, you go by the artist's last name, you pull up the drawer, you can take out their file and sit down and go through it. There's interesting things in those files.
There are, yeah. And Rosa's is really fun too, there's a lot in there.
So when you're giving a tour to a bunch of people who come in, from skiing or whatever, do you talk about the artist this much, or do you talk about the actual painting that they're looking at?
I mean, I would say Rosa's story is so interesting that it's maybe worth talking about her a little bit, but I suppose it depends on the tour and what they're interested in.
And how many women are in the group?
Right,
I hardly ever talk about the painting.
I know.
Right.
I talk about the
I
artist
don't know
a
that
lot.
much about the painting. I don't know how much she even really used pastel,
No, but nobody else, that's the cool thing, nobody else was really doing it. She was always out of the box. And she was a big sculptor too.
Yeah.
Was she?
Yep.
Yeah. Better than, and everything you read is that she was always better than her brothers.
Oh.
Because, and they're the ones who were allowed all the formal training, and, she
Yeah.
wasn't allowed to go to art school. And today, when you think about that,
Right.
it's just crazy in our world and in America.
Didn't Bill Kerr find this in a hotel?
It was like in a coat check, it was hanging like in a coat, right, in a hotel coat check area.
And he saw it and like made a mental note and then came back years later and it was still there, so he
Asked them if they would sell it. And then initially, I think he was told no, and then years later, a certain number of years later, they came back and said, okay, we're ready to sell it, are you still interested?
Who bought it?
Bill Kerr.
in
It was
a,
a coat check area, hanging in a coat check
Was
area.
it in France?
No. Do you remember where it was, Lisa? It was in the States, I believe.
check. Yeah, I think so.
But I can't remember where.
And it's
I
interesting.
read it yesterday, but I can't.
Who had a coat like that big?
I know.
And students always say, well, if she was so into women's suffrage and she was such a powerful female figure, why is she painting a male stag? And you wonder, like, if it's, but she's struggling with the masculine, feminine identities in her own culture and within herself. So it's kind of an interesting self-reflection, maybe. I don't know. It's a cool question that more than one student has asked me.
Really?
Yeah. Like, and then the females are like all timid back there. Why isn't the female in the front?
But it's
I mean, it's
nighttime,
all
let the
time.
guy go get in trouble.
Yeah.
And that Doug Allen does the nighttime paintings, and I don't think they're nearly as nice.
I know, this is such a beautiful nighttime
And the
painting
painting
with
at
the
nighttime
moonlight.
is really hard, apparently, that much I know. When you paint.
I've never tried it. I wouldn't try
I
it.
know.
That's
Wouldn't
sweet.
mind.
Yeah, so unlike Bonheur, who had the support of her father, apparently Friese did not. Friese's father was like sort of a government secretary, I guess, who wanted Richard Friese to continue in his footsteps. So he did not have his father's support with art, but Friese, his career as a wildlife artist sort of started when he took a job as a lithographer against the will of his father, but he really learned to sketch when he was working as a lithographer, and his paintings primarily focused on big game, European moose, elk, deer, lions, and polar bears. He painted with great precision and finished only one large painting a year, which is one of the reasons his work is quite rare. So we don't have very many here, I don't know.
We have two hanging.
A lot of his paintings were
We have
lost
two.
during
Two.
During the war.
And a lot lost during the war, and that was one of the other big reasons that we don't have very much. So he's quite collectible, I guess, and hard to
I
find.
don't know if it's currently, but it's
Yes,
not done.
he was born in East Prussia, died in Germany.
Used to have two in
He traveled a lot. He traveled extensively and painted wildlife in their natural habitats. So of course he was one of the first artists to stress the importance of doing that. In the late 1890s, he went to Norway to study polar bears, and also hunted 3 while he was there. And he became fascinated with snow and ice as subjects while he was in Norway. So you can see the polar bear piece is what we're talking about here, and how good he was at capturing the snow and the light of the snow.
What kind of a deer do you suppose that is?
It's a red deer, isn't it?
Or what
I think
kind?
it's a red.
Isn't it a red
I
deer?
think it's a red deer.
Red deer.
Does it say, you know what I do?
Deer in a forest. Oh, so this is the one that was called Pasha, which was, okay, so this tells us, Friese depicted Pasha, a large stag shot by Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1910. So the Kaiser commissioned Friese to paint this.
Before he killed it.
Before, yeah, he killed it. It was one of his trophy
Oh, is
deer.
that right? Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
But it's interesting to me how it's like doing this kind of, quiet gestures, pawing at the ground to make its bed for the night, which is really different from the trophy animals.
Really, it's almost
standing up.
a royal bow too. Really, to me, that's what it looks like. It's kind of a curtsy.
Interesting.
I don't know if that's something I just made up, but that's what I kind of see.
So then who shot the deer? Who shot?
This Kaiser Wilhelm II.
And it was on
Yeah.
his private estate.
Yes, so I think Kaiser he really enjoyed Friese's work and sort of followed him as an artist. And commissioned him, I think, probably several times, the way I understood it. Friese's friends often invited him on hunting excursions. He was a big hunter. One such adventure occurred in New Brunswick with Carl Rungius. Friese was, the story goes, he was horrified to sleep in a tent during a thunderstorm, and Rungius said, "I warned him, but he refused to believe that he was going into the wilderness. He thought there would always be a farmhouse with feather beds like in Norway." So he spent some time with Rungius. Rungius sort of considered Friese to be a mentor. They sort of bounced ideas off each other to some extent, I think, and were contemporaries. Friese received numerous awards, including a gold medal at the 1886 Paris Salon. Friese taught at the Academy in Berlin, and Kuhnert was one of the students.
Isn't that interesting? Of the big 4, 3 are
Right.
Germans.
Right.
There must have been good art academies in Germany, maybe.
Must have been.
In Berlin.
So did you say we have a polar bear of his?
And the JKM Conservation Gallery. You're right, it's in the conservation.
Oh, yeah.
We can go look at it. It's really pretty
With the
amazing.
is that the one with the polar bears like going through the
With a
snow?
diagonal.
On the right
Mhm.
diagonal kind of a trail through.
Visitors will tell you they've been to that spot. I've had a lot of people
Spitsbergen.
say, yeah.
There's a what?
Spitsbergen Island is the location of that polar bear painting, and visitors will sometimes say, "I've been to Spitsbergen Island in the Arctic."
Yeah.
That's my favorite wall.
That painting?
It's magical.
Yeah, it's a
The
beautiful
snow,
painting.
the colors of the snow. Just can look and look and look and see everything in the white. Oh, love it.
And is this the one, Rachel, that we don't know all what happened during World War II? There's some question about, is it this one? Does the label remember?
I think so.
I remember someone talked about this at a previous training. Maybe it was Bobby or Susan, I'm not sure.
It doesn't say on the label, but my memory is that there was some question when we acquired this one about its provenance and what happened to it during World War II and how it ended up with us. There was some research being done, basically, and they probably didn't put it on the label intentionally because there's still some question that's being researched.
Wow.
Could be.
But, I mean, some of you were on that, when we took that volunteer trip to, oh boy, Oklahoma, and there was a painting that the docent told us, there's been some question about the provenance of this piece, about, with World War II, about it being stolen, and in fact, shortly after we came back from that trip, there was a lot in the news that the museum had to give it up.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was a beautiful little painting. It was
small.
like a peasant, small
Yeah.
peasant woman feeding chickens, if
Yes.
I remember correctly. And then we had just seen it, and like a week later after we came back, it was like all over the news. Yeah.
Where did it go after?
Had to go back to the Jewish family that it was stolen from during World War II.
Oh, wow.
So it's conceivable that something like that could happen to this.
I guess.
Yeah, it's always a possibility.
They stole a lot.
Hi, Bobby.
Hey.
Alright, well, that's,
That's really helpful, Rachel. So it becomes, I mean, it starts to, the more you learn about the different pieces in this room, it starts to, I used to find this the hardest room to talk about. I don't know why, but I think the more that you start to say, okay, this was people who weren't going out in the field, this is people who were going out in the field, and understanding what a difference that made for the future of wildlife art. And now,
And the
everybody goes
interesting-
out in the field.
right, and the interesting connection to Rungus and really pulling
Yes.
the American part in
Right.
from that connection is interesting.
That is
I
interesting.
think you could do a tour based on resources, you could do a tour based on time, which is how we kind of have it laid out. And there's all kinds of ways you can do the tours that have nothing to do with brush strokes and coloring. I mean, you can.
Talk more about time. You said you could do a tour based on.
Oh, based on time, like relative, whether it's the war or origin of the species, that kind of thing, or we're not using metal for weapons anymore, we're using it bronze for sculpture,
Oh, nice.
that type of thinking.
Like the era, the time period.
Correct, yeah.
Uh-huh. Like it.
The cultural.
Well, it's
going
when
on
you
cultural
talk about-
documents.
No,
No, that's
go ahead.
Well, going from European to American, what kind of bridge?
Yeah, so when you go in and look at the, so either whether you go into the American New Frontiers, JKM space, or if you go into Rungus next, you know, these early artists who were painting in America were, a lot of them originally from Europe, had been trained in, or had been trained in Europe, and were bringing that training to this country, and then also trying to break away from the traditions, the European traditions, and create a new American art form was of interest to them. And whether that translated to like the Taos artists painting Native Americans and the bright light in the American Southwest, or whether it was like Rungus, you know, doing what nobody else had done in terms of painting the landscape and these animals, not in a studio, but capturing the light out in the open air landscape.
You know how you talk about being new? Robert Bateman says part of the reason he thinks wildlife art wasn't so respected was because kind of by the time he came around, it had already been done. And there wasn't anything like really new about it. Because he says, you know, he's Canada's most famous artist, but the 3 big art museums in Canada don't have one of his works.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, if you go, maybe they do now, but at the time he did this interview, and he said, I don't really care about that. There are bigger problems in the world than them not having my work. You know, he's amazing, you know, when he talks about that. But he said wildlife art as a whole just, and you see that. People come here, I think, not thinking. I thought at first it's going to be dirty Western art. But it's not.
It's clean Western.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, Bobby, since you're here, we were hearing about Rosa Bonheur, and a couple people mentioned what a good tour you give telling about Rosa Bonheur. Could you tell us what you say or what you emphasize?
First of all, who she was and where she was. And she had this compound outside of Paris with lots of animals. And I hear that she actually would get roadkill and paint it too. And for still life, I guess. Anyway, you know, the fact that she tried all her life to get into the Painters Guild, the big, you know, French thing, and of course never was allowed because she was a woman, you know. So anyway, but she was very independent. She kept on painting, she never stopped. She got very popular and sold a lot, but still not being able to get into an artist guild is really hard. And I read a little bit about her. She kind of reminded me of Katharine Hepburn. She wore pants, she smoked, she was very much her own person, stayed very much her own person, and was actually a very popular artist, but that part was sad. And her brother, who they said, well, who knows, wasn't quite as good of artist as she is, did get in, and she didn't.
Just because he was a guy.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know what coat closet this was found in? We didn't know.
I'm sorry.
Somebody said it was
Bill
found
Kerr
in a coat closet.
found this in a coat
Yeah,
check
somebody,
area.
yeah.
Do you know where that was?
I think I heard it one time. That's a good thing. We'll look that up again. And of course, I look at the, there's still a few, original frames, which are they're amazing. But in some ways, they could almost take away from the art. And I don't really think it does with her. I don't know. I like her art. It seems to go with it. Yeah, where did they find that?
We couldn't remember. It was in the hotel.
Yesterday,
You found
and I
it?
read it yesterday.
Rachel's
and I-
gonna find it in the
But
file
it'll be
and
easy for me
email
to
us.
And of course,
In a hotel coat check
Yeah,
area.
yeah, in the east somewhere, I think, but I don't remember.
and I always say, that I'm really pushing for an all-woman artist room. We've had one since I've been here, and that was a long time ago. And we have plenty of women artists. We could fill a whole room easily. So let's push for it.
So do you envision that as, okay, we've had temporary exhibits called Women in Wildlife Art, remember that?
2 or something?
maybe.
I came across that too.
But are you saying like a permanent room, like Conservation Gallery, or are you saying temporary?
Well, I'd love it permanent, but I'm not sure they'd ever do that.
Right,
So I'd go for
I would too.
anything.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, you could send it to the Museum of Women in the Arts, it's one of his traveling trips.
And we did have an exhibit from them as a traveling exhibit, temporary exhibit here, Museum of Women in the Arts.
It was
Yep.
it was before Rungus, so it was quite a long time ago. It was wonderful. I mean, we have the bronzes and the paintings, and we have enough to fill a room easily.
That reminded me when you said that, and their initials, National Museum of Women in the Arts.
Right.
Yeah,
NMWA.
yeah. I don't know. I would have loved to have known her.
I know.
To add to that, I've learned that during the Photography at the Summit thing in September, they're going to have a whole day of women photographers
Yeah,
in the West.
that's true, and it's going to be here.
Yeah.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What
And
is it?
that there's going to be, right after Photography at the Summit, like that Saturday,
Yeah.
Photography at the Summit ends on a Friday.
Okay.
That Saturday, there's a day-long workshop in partnership with the Teton Photography Club and our museum. Lisa Simmons and I have been talking with them, planning this for a few weeks now. And it's called Women Wildlife Photographers Symposium or something like that.
yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
That'd be
And there'll
great.
be a whole bunch of speakers, and there will be a scholarship for 2 or 3 local teen girls to attend. And there will be discounts for members of our organization and of the Teton Photography Club. So
Wow, that sounds great.
I wish I knew the date off the top of my head, but you can find it easily by looking up when Photography at the Summit.
I'm guessing it's
Right
probably
after
like,
September,
probably
late
something
September.
like the 21st maybe
Of September?
I'm just
I think so
guessing.
too, somewhere at the end, that last week
It's
or so of.
the week after
It's after
the
Western
end of
Division.
Western Vision
Yeah,
is when
yeah.
Photography at the Summit
Right,
starts.
yeah, it's always
Right
that
after
week.
So it's like 2 weekends after the end of Western Vision.
Yes,
maybe?
that's right.
Yeah.
What Rachel said.
It might be like the last weekend of September, maybe, or the next to last weekend
Right
of
in
September.
there, yeah.
Jane, what would you say about that painting?
The cranes or
No,
the leopard?
The purple
The
one,
purple
leopard and Queen Victoria and the domain. People ask about it and I'm always like, not my favorite one.
It's not- I know,
Ooh,
I mean,
that's a
what I
no-no.
usually say is there are different ways of interpreting this piece. You could refer to the myth of amethystos,
Yeah,
which I think is on the
definitely myth,
label.
yeah.
Right.
I think the
Or
point
you
too is
could
the fantastical, the mythical,
the colonies, like another interpretation would be the boy, Great Britain and her reaching out to her colonies
Some
is
would say-
another
yeah.
interpretation. of
That's
it.
interesting.
I've heard that, and I'm like, I just think
I
it's
don't
like
see
that other
that
one,
in there.
she's too close.
I don't know I honestly don't know what to say about it much. It's not one I choose to talk about, and I don't know why. I like the painting, but it's just hard to talk about.
It is.
And if somebody asks, I will, but I'll pretty much say what's on the label.
Allison, do you talk about it?
No, I don't.
Is there anybody here who likes to talk about that one? I mean, I wish I could say I liked to talk about every piece in this collection, but some are easier to talk about than
I think
others.
it just fits in on the timeline of, you know,
Animals not in their natural
not in
habitat,
their natural
more
habitat. They're not-
fantastical,
The artist isn't out in the
symbolic.
wild painting something as it appears in nature. It's,
Uh-huh.
they've taken an animal and they've put it in a landscape, but it's mystical and mythical and
I kind of forget the
mythological,
two up top.
fantastical.
It has all those irises in the
Right.
And they
background,
talk about
which
that.
don't grow in Africa probably.
Right, and so it becomes more like, that's why sometimes people say the purple color is maybe connected to royalty in Great Britain, and that's why those flowers are in there.
Oh.
But I don't know. I'm telling you what I've heard other people say. But I do think, and this is something I should research more, that there's this whole group of paintings done during the Victorian era of beautiful, you know, women dressed in gauzy dresses in, you know, interacting with wildlife or in nature. And I forget what they're called. There's like a name for those paintings of beautiful women in nature. Fairy painting? Oh, they're called fairy paintings.
Very.
So this fits
Is
within,
this one of them?
I think this fits within that genre of fairy paintings.
Huh.
It's a very Victorian thing.
It's good to be able to talk about everything in here, but on the other hand, when you come in with a group, you really don't have time to maybe touch on more than 3 works, I would say.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had people ask, and I'm like, I haven't a clue.
Oh.
I mean,
You
you
have a
fumble
clue,
through it,
but-
but,
right.
you know.
Right. So if anybody here gets interested in researching this more
Go
and
for it,
wants to
Lori.
give us a tour just of this painting
That would be
sometime,
good.
that would be nice.
We haven't talked about the sculpture. Are there people here, docents here, who talk about any of the sculpture in here?
Yeah.
Oh, you're right, we haven't talked about the sculpture.
I do.
Lisa,
What ones do you
Lisa
talk about?
Simmons has left us, but she talks a lot about sculpture. What do you say, Lori?
I say, because I've talked about it outside of it summertime, but I talk about RA, the prey and predator. Metal used to be, you know, sculpture was made from a lot of different things. It was metal after they stopped with weapons. And these 3 are here because they were influential on today's sculptors. So I talk about RA, the prey and predator. He was really big on doing lions and felines for all his. Rodin had a platoon. He, you know, it's the gift that keeps on giving, because this was sculpted after he was dead. And this used to be on a tomb. And then Bugatti, because we still have that other Bugatti. I talk about Bugatti, the youngest, you know, his brother made, you know, the cars. His dad was a furniture maker, and he did that eland. So I just kind of talk about it, because I prefer to talk about it than that painting, so I'll talk about that.
But they're beautiful pieces, and I don't typically talk about them, because you can't talk about everything, but I think people are interested
They
in them.
are,
And I know Lisa Simmons always talks about the 2 lions, and in particular, what she talks about is how differently they're depicted. The very loose impressionistic style of the Rodin, and the more detailed, more representational, you can see the individual hairs of the Barry.
and he was the first guy to do animals. I mean, there were others, but he's the first one who really gets credited.
Yeah.
I got a book out of the library, it was called The Animaliers, and they kind of talk about all of that. You know, I don't read them all, but you can skim them enough to get enough information. And I think the hardest part about giving a tour is going through your Rolodex brain. You can't tell everybody everything you know, and every tour will be different. You just have to kind of deduce if people, you have to read their minds, what they might want to know.
I know. Sometimes if I come in with a group, I'll just watch them and see where their eyes go.
Oh,
And then I'll
that's
decide, oh, okay, let's go over there. I see a bunch of you are looking at this piece.
Do they all
over
do
here.
the same thing? They all-
You know, sometimes you can get, sometimes it's easier than other times. but-
People almost always go, I never like to go to the Rungus room after here, I like to go to North America and then come back. But people flow into that hole. So
Well,
I
but it's easy to flow because you talk about,
Yeah.
you know, the four, you know, and you end up
And
with
then lead
Rungus.
into
Yeah,
And you
going
say
to
this
them.
museum actually began with a family collecting Rungus paintings. That's how it all started. And then you can just go in there fairly easily.
That's a nice segue. Talk about the big four, end with Ruggis, and then go into. Oh, and here's another bit of information you may not know about. If you ever have a group that's particularly interested in prints, whether it's lithographs, etchings, wood block prints, whatever, screen prints, we don't have much in the galleries right now. We don't have any Warhols up or any of that stuff. And so Lizzie, because we had some groups that were particularly interested in that, Lizzie rehung the conference room and it's all prints now. So if you ever have a group that's really interested in that, bring them in.